So, of course, my theory topic today is imperialism. And so I'm going to focus mostly on imperialism. The absolute best analysis, even if not the most up-to-date, is Vladimir Ilyich Lenin's Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. And I'm going to make this point several times, but I want to make it just right from the onset. If you want to understand the financial crisis today in its totality, you need to read Vladimir Ilyich Lenin's Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. If you read the pages almost 100 years, or perhaps almost 100 years old, everything that it says reads like it comes out of the front page. As a side note, it is also, as leftists, impossible to talk about imperialism without also talking about national liberation. And so, to a certain extent, I will briefly at the end touch on national liberation. So, to begin, the origin of imperialism can be found in monopolies. There are four main types of monopolies, or four main monopolistic functions. The first is a production monopoly. The second is a raw material monopoly. The third is a banking monopoly. And the fourth is colonialism proper. And all of these are interconnected. One should never believe to have an individual monopoly that is of only one variety, unconnected to other forms of imperialism, is the gross exception rather than the rule. And I will make reference to numerous current examples as we go further. But let us begin with the production monopoly. Production monopolies are made for basically two main reasons. One is integration cuts cost, and the second is that the monopoly functions through integration to exclude new firms from competition. So let's deal with the second for integration of cost. Walmart, right? The fundamental way in which Walmart is integrated, and one of the fundamental strengths of an integrated Walmart, is its ability to negotiate price. If you want to be a successful consumer goods distributor, pretty much without exception, you need a place to distribute those goods. These are retail distributors. And a lot of Walmart's power comes from the fact that they are integrated. And because they're integrated and they have a large productive base, right, in this case distribution in the form of retail, they can negotiate for price. And we can look at this all throughout history, right? While the American economy was first rising at the turn of the century, right, end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, you had coal, you had steel, you have railroads. And each one of these groups would integrate, right? Standard Oil with Rockefeller. And so by integrating, what happened is they were able, all the coal companies, right, who make coke in the sense of, right, high efficiency coal, are able then to negotiate with the railroad companies, right, for their trains. They're able to negotiate price with their steel companies. And simultaneously, steel companies, by being integrated, are able to negotiate down the price on coal, the price on pig iron, right? It's pretty self-evident. And when most people think of monopolies, they think of this, a production monopoly, right? Microsoft, etc., that controls the production of a single good. But there's another aspect integral to it, which is if you have a production monopoly, you can also integrate the supply line. Walmart, again, is a really, really good example of this. Part of the reason that Walmart is so profitable is because they're integrated basically from the factories in China to the store shelves, right, in Orem. Because they're integrated like that, they can have a really strong control of their supply line. And this control of your supply line, right, and this management of supply line really leads to a lot more efficiencies. Imagine for a second if the Chinese factories made, I don't know, the lead poisoning toys, right? They would have to negotiate. This is without a monopoly. They would then have to independently negotiate with a transport firm, right, who would then negotiate to transport those to America. And then the transport firm would then have to negotiate with another, like, on-the-ground transport firm to distribute these across America. And then they would have to negotiate with retail distributors to, get the poison toys on the shelves. And then they would have to negotiate with an advertiser, right, to advertise for them. And then they would have to negotiate with a bunch of lawyers to deal with the inevitable lawsuits of the poisoned children, right? As you'll notice, it's not very efficient. Under our current system, you can go from making the poison toys to fighting litigation for the poison toys, all in one giant corporation, right? And hence the joys of Walmart and our various, productive integration. And of course, Lenin, right, makes a point of this, and this is very important to note. Monopolies are progressive. They do something that small, independent, right, Yemen businessmen, that is the myth of the American business, they can do something that they can't, which is they can lower costs, they can socialize labor, so the division of labor is done well, and they can have a relatively well-organized and centralized economy. So as Lenin says, competition becomes transformed into a monopoly. The result is immense progress in the socialization of production, in particular, in the process of technical innovation and improvement becomes socialized. Right? An improvement in toy manufacturing or any sort of manufacturing, right, if you're integrated, can immediately be put into practice. An advancement in transport can immediately be put into practice. You don't have to go through this free market nightmare of endless negotiation, right? These sorts of advancements immediately, relatively speaking, come into play. So this is the production monopoly. This leads us, of course, to the raw material monopolies, which are also very important to the process of production. As anyone who was here last week, some people have the economic view that raw materials are the most important thing, which I think is misguided, but they do play a very important role. For example, most raw material monopolies can effectively monopolize any subsidiary business. And we saw this in our history, right? The coal industry could then buy up parts of the train industry, right? Because the trains needed the coal, so it was very easy to just sink a small portion of one's profits into a subsidiary industry. Then the train industry, right, could sink just a small bit of profit into the distribution, or the longshoremen, or the docks. And then those, of course, could sink just a small bit of their profits, right, into the shipping industry. And so from these original, right, monopolies, you get a spiraling effect all the way down. And if you don't think this happens, just look at the oil companies, right? Oil companies are vertically integrated. That means from the second someone surveys for oil in the ground to just about, they're actually changing it, just about the moment that you put it in your gas, right, Chevron, Texaco gets a cut every step of the way because it's their business. It's all completely integrated. From the transportation, from the refinery, all of it. Same thing with Shell. Same thing, I mean, and you can take your pick of any large industry, U.S. Steel, right, the automotive industry. These raw material monopolies have a finger in it all the way down. And of course, when you're in a productive economy, this is of the utmost importance. But what happens is also, these are the fiercest competing organizations. Just like for other productive monopolies, it's difficult to get the capital to start a new Walmart. It's immensely difficult to get the financial capital to start a new Kennecott, to start a new Shell oil refinery, right? And so the very costs make it so very quickly only a few raw material monopolies exist. And we can see this everywhere, from our food supply, from Tyson Chicken, Archer Farms, to oil. Chevron, Texaco, Shell Corporation, right? Anywhere you pump gas, essentially. So this all falls within the regular scope of capitalism. There's nothing special about it. It's just production. But imperialism and monopolies also add two other forms. And this is the most important form of monopoly under imperialism, which should ring very true to us today. And that is banking monopolies. Banking monopolies, whereas previously, I'll just quote Lenin here, but just briefly, banks gain profit through the financial industry, but moreover, the loans they issue serve to consolidate their hold over industry. And this is if you think about what capitalism purports to be, right? Industrialist people working to make new products to serve goals, right? Banks should serve only a minor function. And yet today, it is the banking industry, right, that gets a complete, pretty much, now they're adding some because people were angry, but basically initially the banks got a no strings attached, complete universal bailout, whereas, and of course, right, again, banking, what do they do? What do they produce? Nothing except capital. So not even a real industry, if we want to make that higher distinction between the real and the fake economy, they get no strings attached. But look at any of the automotive industries, right? The big three, right? Which just admits that it's a monopoly, a production monopoly. But under our current system of capitalism, people who make real products get massive amounts of restrictions. They get cut down. They don't get the blank check, if you'll pardon the term, that banks get. So Lenin, nearly 100 years ago, points out the absurdity of this and its effects. Banks hold disproportionate sway over other investors because they control a strong interest in child companies all the way down. The principal and primary function of banks is to serve as middlemen in making of payments. In so doing, they transform the inactive money of capital into active, that is, capital yielding a profit. They collect all kinds of money revenues and place them at the disposal of the capitalist class. As banking develops and becomes concentrated in a small number of establishments, the banks grow from modest middlemen to powerful monopolies that have their command over the whole of money capital of all the capitalists and the small businessmen, and also the larger part of the means of production and sources of raw materials in any one country and in a number of other countries. The transformation of the process from numerous modest middlemen into a handful of monopolists is one of the fundamental processes in the growth of capitalism into capitalist imperialism. For this reason, we must, first of all, examine the concentration of banking. So again, it's not the case that there's a real economy and a fake economy. The rise of banks as monopolistic controlling interests is the necessary function of capitalism moving to the next stage, which is to say, capitalist imperialism. And so, of course, right, again, they gain money through finance, through interest rates, through loans, etc., etc. But the interesting thing about the loans is the loans serve to consolidate industry under the bank. If you take a loan from a bank, you follow the bank's rules. And in fact, this was the core of our crisis. The banks no longer wanted to offer loans to other companies, right? It was a credit freeze, right? This is nothing more than, does nothing more than demonstrate that the entirety of our industry, of our economy, depends and is monopolized and is controlled both directly and indirectly by financial capital, by the banking class. And every time they issue a loan, it is very easy for a bank to use a little bit of that loan money to buy a chunk of the company. And then when that company makes a child company in order to fulfill some function, it's very easy for the bank then to by issuing a loan to that, use a little bit of the money to buy a little bit of that child company. And so what you have is you have large investment banks like Bear Stearns, like Merrill Lynch, investment companies or insurance companies that basically, again, they insure by offering loans and protections, like AIG, linked everywhere to every aspect of our economy, so that if something happens to them, right, the entire system goes down with them. And so again, it can't be overstated how much power the banks have. Now, this leads us to what most people think of as imperialism, which is an important part, but by no means the most important part, which is colonialism, right? Colonialism, at its root, is a colony. And basically, colonies can serve either to support production, they can support the raw materials, or what they can do is they can support the banking monopolies. And the basic way they do it is this. Actually, Iraq is a perfect example of all of these monopolies at play. First, we have a production monopoly. In Iraq, they do not have the sorts of standards and restrictions that we have. So it is very easy for refineries, for oil companies, right, to set up a refinery there that belches toxins into the air and poisons the water, and have a monopoly on this in order for the sake of production, right? So we have a productive monopoly. But then also, it is very easy for these corporations, which again received no bid contracts, to have, right, raw material. They are the ones that extract the oil from the very ground itself. So you have them extracting the raw materials, then you have them bringing it to a traditional, right, production facility in the form of refineries. And then you have the banking institutions, which out of the, and you can watch this, watch it happen in Haiti. It's going to happen in Haiti, it happens all over the world, but I'll use Iraq for the example. You have glorious humanitarian banking institutions offering loans to the poor, downtrodden Iraqis, soon to be Haitians, soon to be Colombians, soon to be take your pick, anywhere the WTO, the World Trade Organization, or the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, can get a foothold. They offer these loans at very reasonable rates, and by offering these loans, all that they require is that these countries, these people, completely alter their entire economic system so to only buy or make it incredibly easy to buy foreign capital. That is to say, it makes it easy for foreign investors to, right, invest, whereas it makes it very difficult for local investors. It makes it very easy, or sometimes there are even explicit restrictions. Some of you may remember, Iraq, in its reconstruction, cannot buy from Russians, from Germans, from French, because they were not part of the coalition of the willing, and they were not willing to invade. So instead of this free market laissez-faire utopia that the neocons said, I don't know that they really led us to believe that it would happen, but said would occur, right? What you actually have is you have banks that issue loans to Iraqis who can then only buy American or coalition goods. They can only buy coalition refinery machines. They can only buy American pipes. They can only buy American military equipment. And so the bank makes money twice, right? Once in issuing the loan, and then once again in collecting, well actually, I'm sorry, 3 times. Once in issuing the loan, once in collecting on the loan, and that's including interest, and then once by having a controlling interest in all the companies that then are buying the goods. All of this done, right, under the name of free trade. So this is a colony. There are direct colonies like Iraq or Israel, where you have a state that occupies and exists there, and you have military bases that then periodically shake down the local population. But then you have informal colonies, like Mexico, right? How many American troops are stationed in Mexico? Very few, and most of them are there covertly. But they don't need to station them there, right? They issue loans, they issue trade through NAFTA, they buy up all of, right, the factories, they build all the factories, they buy up all the food, they buy up all the raw materials, and then at the end of the day, they don't need the soldiers, right? They can just use the Mexican soldiers to imperialize the Mexicans, because all of our oppression of Mexico is done on paper, through banks, through loans. So Mexico is demonstrably a colony of the United States, and yet no American has to gun down a Mexican in the street. No American has to take communally held land from indigenous people, because you can have a colony, and in fact most of our current colonies are done through the paper trail, through the banks. So again, you don't need to have an occupation. You can just issue loans. And as a matter of fact, if someone doesn't want to play ball, just don't issue them any loans. And don't let any of your raw materials go to them, and don't do any production for them, and don't let them use your transport, and very quickly they will be starved out and they will die. Sometimes figuratively, and sometimes literally. So this brings us to imperialism proper, right, as the highest stage of capitalism. And Lenin does quite a good job of it. Of imperialism, he says, imperialism, or the domination of finance capital, is the highest stage of capitalism, in which this separation reaches vast proportions. The supremacy of finance capital over all other forms of capital means the predominance of the retainer and the financial oligarchy, retainer being money issued vis-a-vis a loan of something of that variety. It means that a number of financially, quote, powerful states stand out among all the rest. So again, it's not that we have, as Americans, forgotten the real economy in favor of our imaginary economy, but that the imaginary economy of banking and the financial institutions is the real economy. And if you don't believe that, just look at default credit swaps. A crazy form of loan/insurance that produces nothing, that promises to produce nothing, is enough to bring our economy to a screeching halt, rather. So how does imperialism operate? It's a struggle to control capital that may remain hidden or open. It may take the form of shock and awe, or it may take the form of the World Trade Organization and IMF's structural readjustments. You should simply because you don't see soldiers with guns does not mean that imperialism is not taking place. And sometimes it's well, I don't want to say perfectly hidden, but quite well hidden. Look at Haiti and Aristide, right? He was a democratically elected leader, and through these noble humanitarians who were ex-soldiers, they invaded the country and toppled the regime. And they were so popular with the people that I believe it's Jean-Philippe, when he ran for president in this most recent election, he managed to get a whopping 1.7% of the vote. So again, even if, but who was behind that? As a matter of fact, it was the United States and the Bush administration. There was connections all the way through to the CIA and the State Department. If this sounds like a crazy conspiracy theory, there's one that is indubitable. Chile. These radical revolutionaries for free capitalism and liberty murdered the democratically elected leader of Chile, and they did so with CIA backing, both material, logistical, and informational, and support of the Chicago School of Economics. So again, it can be open or hidden. Also, it's the struggle to control resources by others that entails other nations to compete for resources in order to stay in the game. If everyone is engaged in imperialism, and your country takes the moral high ground and does not imperialize, on the world market, you will fall behind. There's a very good example of this. Notice the richest countries in the world. The richest countries in the world are the countries that practiced successfully imperialism. Western Europe carved up all of Africa and most of Asia. The United States carved up all of the Americas, the Monroe Doctrine, in case any of you have forgotten. And Japan historically practiced spheres of influence and imperialism all over China, Korea, and various Asian countries. So again, imperialism is itself a self-motivating force, because if you don't engage in it, you will fall behind all of the countries that imperialize. So, we also have, and this is another key fact that we're going to see in Haiti. We've seen it in Afghanistan, we've seen it in Iraq, we've seen it in Panama, we've seen it everywhere that the capitalists practice imperialism. And this needs to be clear. Imperialism is never humanitarian. It doesn't matter what disguise it takes. Imperialists are never bringing civilization and enlightenment. They are always interested in corporate profits. Look at Africa, right? White man's burden was the name that imperialism in Africa went by, which is bringing civilization and humanity to Africa. Now you hear right-wing conservative or fascistic people say, why can't, Africa has had 50 years of independence. Why can't they get their act together? I mean, we brought them education, we brought them technology, we brought them civilization. No. Imperialism is never, ever, regardless of what anyone is ever saying, humanitarian. The reason why Africa is in the shape it is today is because it is constantly imperialized by Western powers. And anyone who talks to you about humanitarian capitalism, of ethical capitalism is about synonymous with ethical rape. All right? So, again, the new forms of imperialism are smarter. Microloans to those poor, desperate people. Again, all of this should never, ever confuse us. It is not humanitarian, ever. And in fact, Lenin, again, quite says this. Or actually, sorry, one more preface. You often hear, where countries engage in trade, they never go to war. We've never gone to war with a country that has a McDonald's. That is the stupidest thing that anyone has ever, well, a lot of stupid things. That is one of the stupidest things that anyone has ever said. It is the competition, the fierce and cutthroat competition, that leads imperialist countries to go to war. World War I, World War II, the various Cold War fiascos and engagements, right? It is trade, right, and capital that generates these conflicts. And as Lenin says, finance, capital, and the trusts do not diminish, but increase the differences in the rate of growth of various parts of the world economy. Once the relation of force has changed, what other solution of the contradictions can be found under capitalism but that of force? And of course, Lenin points out something that's really interesting, is the most imperialized nations in the world also have the greatest foreign creation of railroads. Just like, you'll notice, the countries that are making the most number of refineries today are imperialized nations. It's the Niger Delta. It's Iraq, right? And probably, relatively soon, it will be Venezuela. Imperialism, for all of the production that it brings, just like the railroads, right, were production and transportation, only serve the capitalist interests. You build railroads because you want to get the stuff out of the country in the most efficient way possible. We reconstruct Iraq and Afghanistan, even if it has apparently humanitarian purposes, because this will be the most efficient way for us to extract resources both material and productive, both capital and actual, from a country. And it's important that we, again, and I can't stress this enough, imperialism is never, never humanitarian. So, this leads us to the flip side of imperialism, which is national liberation. Now, at the risk of sounding overly Hegelian, imperialism is complete. And I mean that. It's finished. Which is not to say that we have no imperialism today. We have more imperialism today than perhaps we've ever had. But, as Lenin says, the characteristic feature of this period, he concludes, this is Lenin quoting, I believe, Hobson. But in any case, he says, the characteristic feature of this period, he concludes, is therefore the division of Africa and Polynesia. As there are no unoccupied territories, that is, territories that do not belong to any state in Asia or America, it is necessary to amplify Supin's conclusion, he was an economist, and say that the characteristic feature of the period under review is the final partitioning of the globe. Final, not in the sense that repartition is impossible. On the contrary, repartitions are possible and inevitable, but in the sense that colonial policy of the capitalist countries has completed the seizure of unoccupied territories on our planet. For the first time, the world is completely divided up, so that in the future, only a redivision is possible, i.e., territories can only pass from one owner to another, instead of passing from ownerless territory to an owner. In this case, this is why imperialism has been so linked as a Marxist-Leninist concept. And anti-imperialist anarchists do exist and should be commended, but don't have the theoretical framework to deal with this. Because at this point, the notion of Yemen farmers, uninfluenced by state corruption, untouched by the domination of capitalism, is finished. There was a point when that could happen. There was a point where the Zulu could have forced out the Boers and could have forced out the English. There was a point in which the Wampanoags could have butchered and driven the Pilgrims into the sea, and perhaps should have. There was a point in which the Indian kingdoms could have unified and stood up against the East Indian Company. That time is gone. The time of anti-imperialism, in the sense of being free from imperialism, no longer exists. And again, this is perhaps where I'm too Hegelian. We are inured in imperialism. And all anti-imperialist struggles are national liberation struggles. So what does this mean? National liberation aims to put control back in the hands of the people rather than the imperialist nations. So, for example, there was no point in which Palestine was going to go back to being an unintegrated state. There was no time in which Palestine could have been free from the state strictures. Instead, their fight is one of national liberation. You either liberate your nation from the British, or you liberate your nation from the Israelis, but you need to liberate your nation. And that national liberation is itself a liberation of a nation, owned, no longer unowned, right, of which people live, but a nation owned by the people, right? And so this is the essence of a national liberation struggle. Now, about national liberation struggles, we should always be critical. Always be critical of any struggle, right? Capitalism so often, hides its face in the mask of humanitarianism, so we must always be critical. However, we must also always support national liberation against capitalist imperialism. We are at the stage where our world market is connected and shackled by the chains of imperialism. And today, to be a socialist, to be a communist, to be an anti-capitalist entails that we always remain anti-imperialist and struggle for national liberation and support struggles for national liberation. Thank you very much. Okay, so question?
Paul, did you want to go? Or?
Yeah, I had a question. Well, you talked about national liberation in that as nations we need to start fighting imperialism and stuff like that. But why not should it be global liberation, where it's more of every anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist, everyone that wants to fight against the imperialists fights at one time, and as a world we take over, or I mean just knock down the imperialism. Because basically that's what it is that it's so integrated into our system that even with a socialist country, just one socialist country that's doing everything correctly, it can't survive. It needs more, and that's why we need to do it as a global scale rather than just a national.
Well, I would always go with countries want independence, nations want liberations, and the people want a revolution. Absolutely, we need a global revolution, and I aim at nothing less than the global abolition of capitalism. However, what you also need to keep in mind are two things. The pragmatics and the theoretical principles involved in national liberation. The thing about pragmatics is capitalists are not integrated, and this is to their benefit most of the time. And the reason why it's to their benefit is because by not being integrated, their competition spurs a sort of progress, right? Capitalist progress, which is not for nothing, right? The very fact that we can record this and put it on YouTube, it is something. I don't think it's enough, but it's something. But as a matter of fact, this sort of lack of coherence is very effective when the capitalists get in struggles. And it creates fault lines. Now, these fault lines are not universal or global fault lines. They're particular fault lines to particular situations, right? They're particular sites where revolution is possible. And what we need to do is we need to carry out revolution on those sites. And what we can't do is get... So this is actually... I'll transition it, right? But what we can't do is we can't get caught up in the idealist, and I don't mean idealist in, right, I have values and, oh, you know, I want to change the world. I mean idealist in the sense that one is disconnected from the world and not at all, right, understanding the material conditions. We cannot get into the materialist, we can't avoid the materialist fact that not everywhere is a revolutionary site. Now, this is not to say that revolutionary sites don't come into being, they don't pass away, but the notion, if you substantiate global revolution, and you say we should all globally fight capital, either one of two things happen. Either one, you instantiate it in the form of revolutionary sites, in which case you're led back to national liberation, or what you do is you say every site is a revolutionary site, and we can fight in every site, which, I'll be honest, there are people who agree with that. If that is your view, you would very much enjoy the works of Antonio Negri and Michael Hart, Empire, Multitude, and they have a new book out, Commonwealth. The only problem is, not only does that not work, which is a pretty big problem, but also it reduces any notion of revolution to just a play of powers. On the surface, this may seem incredibly liberating, right? Everyone is both revolutionary and capitalist. And you do revolutionary acts and you do capitalist acts. Well, two things. One is it becomes very elitist. And two, it allows one to actually disengage oneself from the struggle. Well, how would it make it elitist if everyone can do that? Well, I go to, you know, the farmer's market and I only buy local, independently grown, blah, 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 etc., etc. What are the conditions for someone being able to do that? It's that they're being a wealthy Western European or Euro type, right? We're the barbarians of Europe, still part of Europe, but a European, essentially, style country. You know who doesn't have the option of, organic, fair trade coffee and what have you? People starving to death in Darfur, or now Haiti, right? And so what happens is it separates you from the actual context and constructs of real radical revolution. So that's problem one. The second thing is, not only is it elitist in that fashion, two is it renders any analysis basically impossible. If you abandon class, which I believe I have a lecture on our YouTube channel on class theory. If you abandon class and the means of production as the essence of the revolutionary struggle, which again, and here's the thing, national liberation is a means. It's not an end, right? The goal is to overthrow capitalism. The means is, and capitalism uses the means of imperialism, right, and is connected to imperialism. The means by which communism fights imperialism is national liberation. So what happens is then it becomes a play of powers, right? I mean, this is the precise Foucauldian sense of the word, is you just have powers for manipulation. Either you sum up the total of revolutionary powers, you sum up the total of capitalist powers or bourgeois powers, and as soon as one is higher, then that one wins, and as soon as that one is higher, then the other one wins. But in this principle, right, if every sort of action can be revolutionary in a sense, then you don't have to engage in any particular action. Any good revolutionary action will suffice for any other. For example, sharing music, right? That subverts, right? If you do it illegally through BitTorrent, that subverts capitalist production. I mean, this is demonstrably true. Also, it's not cumulative. You can't file share your way to revolution, right? And so this very notion of the play of powers, again, misses the point. So you'll notice we've moved from pragmatics to the theoretical. And so, again, the theoretical aspect is we should always understand national liberation, substantive national liberation, as a progressive anti-capitalist move, right? Anyone, white supremacists in Idaho can declare themselves that they want a white nation. This is not national liberation because it in no way attempts to undermine the conditions of imperialism. They just want to be their own new imperial power. And there's nothing revolutionary about that. Which is, and I want to go back to, we always need to approach this with a critical eye. In America, a really good example is black liberation. There is honest, legitimate black liberation, like the Black Panther Party of previous yesteryear. I'm not too set on the current Black Panther Party, right? But that was black liberation. That was national liberation, right? Because the goal was not to simply become black capitalists or black bourgeois or black imperialists, whereas some of the more I would call them right-wing strains of the Nation of Islam, for example, would not constitute national liberation. It would constitute a racist, capitalist, imperialist effort to make oneself a power. And so in this case, again, I have to say that the notion of global revolution in this form either breaks down into national liberation, and so we're saying the same things, and if we are, then okay, we agree. But if we're not, then I think it's a vacuous and empty phrase that doesn't substantiate itself. Or actually, I'm sorry, Greg had his hand up first.
What qualifies a territory as a revolutionary site, and why is Utah, United States of America, a revolutionary site?
May I add just a little thing on the top of that?
If that's okay with you, Greg.
Just to add, because that's a question I had too. But in addition, if you do, determine what is a revolutionary site, I mean, would you advocate that revolutionaries kind of flock to that area, almost like Mormons converted, came from Europe to here to create a Mormon? I mean, would you advocate and go into certain sites, or again, just trying to turn every site into a revolutionary site, but in the way that you're talking about, rather than just buying fair trade coffee?
Yeah. So I mean, without getting too much into Badiou, although I'll lay my cards on the table. You always hear me say I'm a Marxist-Leninist Maoist. There's a little caveat, which is I believe Badiou is the next step in revolutionary theory, and so I identify myself as a Badiouist. So here's the thing about revolutionary sites. He makes this distinction between a site belonging and a site being included. And some situationists might actually find this be sympathetic in some ways to this. A site that belongs is just a part of it. It's part of the set. The example, which I find actually really obscure, but he uses it, right, is in France, you have a family. And this family belongs to France. It's included in France, right? Which is to say, it belongs, it's directly part of the people of France. And it's out and about. But there's something interesting about this family, which is they're a bunch of illegals. And so they only exist as a family. Otherwise, they flock away, they are in hiding, right? So what happens is when you do the, he calls it the count, something belongs to site, right, this family, but they're not represented, right? All the elements of that family disappear when you look for the French people, right? Because they're not included, they're not represented in this other count, right? Classes are represented, nationalities are represented, right? States are represented, but these singular elements are not, right? And this is the term he uses. Okay, so this is a long theoretical thing, but eventual sites, or revolutionary sites, are those things on the edge of the board. They are those things that are uniquely deterministic. What does an eventual site look like? It looks like the Bolshevik Party. What is special about the Bolshevik Party? Were they particularly popular? No, absolutely not. Were they the driving force of the Russian revolutionary movement? No, that would be the Mensheviks. Did the workers love them? They were more sympathetic. Did the peasants love them? No, not even a little bit. But, and this is the interesting thing, is they form this edge of the revolutionary movement in Russia. They are radical. They do not belong anywhere. They are not represented anywhere. And so rather than just being another organization among all other organizations, they become the revolutionary site simply by the fact of their being on this edge. Now, here's one of the key things about the revolutionary site. There's no guarantee, or the eventual site, that there's going to be an event there. And if you hitch your wagon to an eventual site, you should know that it could collapse. Right? May 68 is a good example. That was an eventual site that collapsed. And it took everyone with it that really, in a substantive way, tied themselves to it. So this is sort of the notion of eventual site. What makes Utah a revolutionary site? This is going to sound glib, and this is going to sound stupid. The thing that makes Utah a revolutionary site is the Revolutionary Students' Union. It is the Mormon worker. It is the self-declared sites that are constantly on the edge of disappearing, of being swallowed by the void, where we have a power of destabilizing the entire set. Where does the Mormon, I hope, this is my understanding of it. This is almost certainly an inaccurate understanding of it, and you can be deeply offended, well, but I do have respect for you. Where does the Mormon worker fit in Mormonism? Right? It belongs to Mormonism, but it's not included, it's not represented, it's not a part in this very precise sense. And so the very radicality of the Mormon worker, right, makes it an eventual site. It threatens to destabilize the totality of everything else there and generate an entirely new situation, right? I mean, this is what an event is. This is what a revolution is. So what makes us an eventual site is that we have an eventual site. I mean, I'm a materialist. There's no way to determine it beforehand. The only way we know is by doing it, by being here, by creating it, by making it, by fighting it, by handing out flyers, by talking, by doing television spots, by putting up a website. And there's no guarantee that, one, it'll ever turn into a revolutionary site. I'm posing that it is. And if it goes down, just like May 68, or should we be so lucky, I go down with it. And so does everyone who genuinely believes in it. But this is the essence of political risk that Americans have become so desensitized to. You need to risk something for it to matter. And so that's why I believe this is a revolutionary site. As for flocking to it, that would depend on the status of the site.
You're not really thinking as much in geographic. I was initially thinking, when you're talking about sites, as that being a geographic thing, but now you define it differently.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is the interesting feature. It can be both. It could be geographic, it could be intellectual, it could be conceptual, it could be ideological, it could be religious. And so it would vary from site to site, right? Obviously, all the people who are interested in reforming Mormonism cannot flock to the Mormon worker, right? Because some of them are not Mormon and are in fact anti-Mormon, right? They would not belong in that site. And I had a very traumatic for me, in a very self-indulgent way, experience when I went to Nepal, which was me flocking to the revolutionary site of Nepal. And they said, we appreciate, and in retrospect, if I were a good Leninist at the time, I would already know this. They said, we appreciate your enthusiasm, but this is our struggle, and this isn't something that we have to do on our own. And the reason why is because it was a struggle for national liberation, right, against American and Indian imperialism. So, because of the very nature of that site, I could not be a part of it. Now, what determines this? Again, I'm a materialist. You don't know until you're confronted with the situation. So, that may be unsatisfactory, but you may not agree, but does that satisfactorily answer both of your questions? Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just wondering, with this emphasis on national liberation, don't you run the risk of kind of creating these anti-capitalist islands who are then besieged by the larger, more numerous capitalist countries, like happened in Cuba, like happened in Russia, happened in Cuba, happened in Russia?
Yeah, no, that's what happens.
So, I mean, why choose to emphasize national liberation instead of global revolution?
Well, I mean, that's the thing, is national liberation is a particular tactic used against particular imperialists. You'll notice, I don't advocate for national liberation, qua national liberation, for the RSU. But it does make sense to support, well, it did make sense to support black liberation as national liberation. Because it's always a pragmatic means of confronting imperialism. Now, of course, my response to you, right, you say as opposed to global liberation. I mean, I've sort of addressed that, but I would actually, I'm going to repose this question. National liberation opposed to what? Right? Where is the what of this global liberation? It sucks really bad that Cuba is a besieged, relatively poor nation that has very few, if any, major political allies and has to basically do it on its own. Also, UNICEF just released a report. Cuba is one of, I believe it is literally the only Latin American nation with no child malnutrition. I'm comfortable with failures like that. And I would always advocate for failed national liberation over any sort of idealist, non-materialist plan or rhetoric that doesn't cash out in a substantive way. And again, I'd highly actually recommend both of you read, again, it sounds like a critique of Gregory coming out of Lenin, but Lenin critiques Karl Kautsky's notion of ultra-imperialism. And of course, the notion of ultra-imperialism is that all these imperialist states get together and start to mitigate their differences so that they can globally oppress people in a more efficient manner. I mean, and if for those of you who have read Gregory and Hart, this sounds like empire. And of course, right, Lenin rips it to shreds that no, as a matter of fact, all this will do is heighten the tensions, which we see. We have no Soviet Union. We have an emphasis on the UN, the WTO, the IMF, and have we become a more peaceful society with universal American hegemony? Not at all. And so, I mean, that would be my response.
To put this in the body framework, the notion of naming the void as opposed to naming the eventual site, Can we see this, the distinction between, in Nazi Germany, they named the void, rather
Right.
as opposed to national liberation and say, I'm trying to think of any successful ones.
No,
Well, the point I'm going to make is this, though, right? If it turns into national liberation, qua national liberation, in order to reproduce bourgeois society, capitalist society, under the pretense of, say, like Germany did or Italy did, then that's naming the void. This is sort of for me, but not.
yeah, well, I'll try and adopt that, no offense, so it's useful for other people.
Sure.
Okay, here's the thing, Nazi Germany. What is Nazi Germany fighting for? Purity. What's purity? Where is purity? Right? Purity is not a concept that can ever actualize. It can never be instantated. And so essentially what they named was they named nothing. They named a void. They named, and not only did they name it, they built their entire framework around this void. And what happened? Collapse. Right? Because there's literally nothing to not National Socialism. There's nothing to it. Whereas a failed revolution, right, which ultimately, right, names the void, in a certain sense, right, the French Revolution. At some point, someone named the French Revolution. They said, this is the French Revolution. What is the French Revolution about? Equality, right, liberty, and fraternity, right? And what you'll notice is that these notions, even in its failure, right, instantated in French society. Haiti was one of the first nations, right, to abolish slavery, and they did so under the French Revolution. And you'll notice we are permeated now with these notions, whereas Nazism itself is reviled, right, and nauseating to us. Because, again, there's nothing to it. It doesn't name anything. It's the difference between naming nothing and naming an infinite truth, which is, again, the equality of all. And so national liberation that names itself as simply, I need mine, or I got mine, Jack, or any of, actually, this is a good example. Look at Africa today. Now, and I don't mean to pick on Africa because obviously most of the damage was imperialist, but when you have ethnic groups, right, naming themselves, right, as the reason for fighting, as Hutu, as Tutsi, right, very rarely is it an actual motion for national liberation. It's a desire to become a new set of capitalists. Whereas, for example, Evo Morales, even though he names indigenismo, right, indigenism, it's not just for the indigenous, right? It's not just whitey go home, right? It's something more. It's something universal in its naming. So, is that
That's great. Thank you.
anything else, or should we wrap it up?
Does anybody else have any pressing questions on imperialism?
Objections?
The things you just described, like trying to relate it back to our lecture you gave on Maoism, or I can't remember if it's historical or Mao, recognizing the principal contradiction, not the secondary contradictions.
Exactly. Yeah, and so national liberation is only a principal contradiction if it is a matter of capitalist principle. So, for example, being against Vietnam and supporting Vietnam's national liberation, right, is something different from, say, supporting, I don't know,
Free Tibet.
Yeah, Free Tibet. Free Tibet is a good example. And so these would be a secondary as opposed to primary contradiction. If that makes sense.
All right, let's give Greg a hand.
Yeah, I was just wondering, with this emphasis on national liberation, don't you run the risk of kind of creating these anti-capitalist islands who are then besieged by the larger, more numerous capitalist countries, like happened in Cuba, like happened in Russia, happened in Cuba, happened in Russia.
Yeah, no, that's what happens.
So, I mean, why choose to emphasize national liberation instead of global revolution?
Well, I mean, that's the thing, is national liberation is a particular tactic used against particular imperialists. You'll notice, I don't advocate for national liberation, qua national liberation, for the RSU. But it does make sense to support, well, it did make sense to support black liberation. as national liberation, because it's always a pragmatic means of confronting imperialism. Now, of course, my response to you, right? You say as opposed to global liberation. I mean, I've sort of addressed that, but I would actually, I'm going to repose this question. National liberation opposed to what? Right? Where is the what of this global liberation? It sucks really bad that Cuba is a besieged, relatively poor nation that has very few, if any, major political allies and has to basically do it on its own. Also, UNICEF just released a report. Cuba is one of, I believe it is literally the only Latin American nation with no child malnutrition. I'm comfortable with failures like that. And I would always advocate for failed national liberation over any sort of idealist, non-materialist plan or rhetoric that doesn't cash out in a substantive way. And again, I'd highly actually recommend both of you read, again, it sounds like a critique of Negri coming out of Lenin, but Lenin critiques Karl Kautsky's notion of ultra-imperialism. And of course, the notion of ultra-imperialism is that all these imperialist states get together and start to mitigate their differences so that they can globally oppress people in a more efficient manner. I mean, and if for those of you who have read Negri and Hart, this sounds like empire. And of course, right, Lenin rips it to shreds that no, as a matter of fact, all this will do is heighten the tensions, which we see. We have no Soviet Union. We have an emphasis on the UN, the WTO, the IMF, and have we become a more peaceful society with universal American hegemony? Not at all. And so, I mean, that would be my response.
To put this in the Badu framework, the notion of naming the void as opposed to naming the eventual site, can we see the distinction between, in Nazi Germany, they named the void, rather
right.
as opposed to national liberation and say, I'm trying to think of any successful ones.
No,
well, the point I'm going to make is this, though, right? If it turns into national liberation, qua national liberation, in order to reproduce bourgeois society, capitalist society, under the pretense of, say, like Germany did or Italy did, then that's naming the void. This is sort of for me, but not.
Yeah, well, I'll try and adopt that. No offense, so it's useful for other people.
Sure.
Okay, here's the thing. Nazi Germany. What is Nazi Germany fighting for? Purity. What's purity? Where is purity? Right? Purity is not a concept that can ever actualize. It can never be instantated. And so essentially what they named was they named nothing. They named a void. They named, and not only did they name it, they built their entire framework around this void. And what happened? Collapse. Right? Because there's literally nothing to not National Socialism. There's nothing to it. Whereas a failed revolution, right, which ultimately, right, names the void, in a certain sense, right, the French Revolution. At some point, someone named the French Revolution. They said, this is the French Revolution. What is the French Revolution about? Equality, right, liberty, and fraternity, right? And what you'll notice is that these notions, even in its failure, right, instantated in French society. Haiti was one of the first nations, right, to abolish slavery, and they did so under the French Revolution. And you'll notice we are permeated now with these notions, whereas Nazism itself is reviled, right, and nauseating to us because, again, there's nothing to it. It doesn't name anything. It's the difference between naming nothing and naming an infinite truth, which is, again, the equality of all. And so national liberation that names itself as simply, I need mine, or I got mine, Jack, or any of, actually this is a good example. Look at Africa today. Now, and I don't mean to pick on Africa because obviously most of the damage was imperialist, but when you have ethnic groups, right, naming themselves, right, as the reason for fighting, as Hutu, as Tutsi, right, very rarely is it an actual motion for national liberation. It's a desire to become a new set of capitalists. Whereas, for example, Evo Morales, even though he names indigenismo, right, indigenism, it's not just for the indigenous, right? It's not just whitey go home, right? It's something more. It's something universal in its naming. So, is that
That's great, thank you.
anything else, or should we wrap it up?
Does anybody else have any pressing questions on imperialism?
Objections?
The things you just described, like trying to relate it back to a lecture you gave on Maoism, or I can't remember if Cisco or Mao, recognizing the principal contradiction and not the secondary contradictions.
Exactly. Yeah, and so national liberation is only a principal contradiction if it is a matter of capitalist principle. So, for example, being against Vietnam and supporting Vietnam's national liberation, right, is something different from, say, supporting, I don't know, any...
Free Tibet.
Yeah, Free Tibet. Free Tibet is a good example. And so these would be a secondary as opposed to primary contradiction, if that makes sense.
All right, let's give Greg a hand.